Xerox just pieces of prose, and we're just going to be looking at a couple of sentences in each one of these. So that's why you don't have the whole essay, you know. I did give you all of Death of the Moth, but I think that's the only one. And then first couple I gave you the whole of because they're very short, like those Done Meditations and this one by Bacon. Okay.
Where's the left of the moth? Yeah, sorry.
There's moth. Oh, are you glad it dies? She's scared of moths. And to clarify that. Okay, so are you guys ready back there?
Yes, we are.
Oh, yay. Okay, so there's a few things that I want you to take out of this seminar, just to focus it a little before we get started. And one of them is that I want you to see how the sentence develops over time, like historically. And so at the end, and as we go along, we'll be I think what we'll be doing on here is like adding all the different ways in which it starts to develop in terms of the sentence. The other thing that I'd like you to see are starting, and we'll get this from these first couple of examples we're going to look at from the 1600s, is I want you to see sort of what some of the basic elements are of the sentence, that the sentence starts with and that the sentence retains all the way through to our present time. I'd also am hoping that you'll get an understanding of how sentences work. Sentence structure is often referred to as syntax, which you might have heard that term. So that you get a sense of what sentence structure is and how it functions, and how it also works to produce rhythm. So as we're looking at some of these sentences, you might listen with your own sort of inner ear. You can even kind of say the sentence over to yourself and try and hear the rhythms of it. And it'll be interesting because you'll hear some of these rhythms repeating throughout history, which is, I think, a really kind of fascinating thing. Also, I'm hoping that you'll get, I'm not going to talk a whole lot, this is not going to be a lecture or a lesson on punctuation, but punctuation is directly related to syntax and to how sentences are put together. So I'm hoping that this will give you some basis with which to understand punctuation, so that punctuation doesn't just feel like a bunch of rules to you, but really starts to fit with what you know about how sentences work. Let's see. And finally, my biggest goal would be that I hope that all of you really begin a love affair with the sentence, because it's a wonderful thing to have a love affair with, and it can last the rest of your writing career. So that's my big main goal. Okay, so I'll read a little bit of the couple of the sentences that we're going to look at in this Of Studies by Francis Bacon. And then I want to ask you some questions about them. All right, so studies serve for delight, for ornament, and for ability. Their chief use for delight is in privateness and retiring, for ornament is in discourse, and for ability is in the judgment and disposition of business. For expert men can execute and perhaps judge of particulars one by one, but the general counsels and the plots and marshalling of affairs come best from those that are learned. Okay, so far, what do you notice about these sentences, which were written, I get the exact date, in 1613.
They're long.
They're facing long.
They're logical.
They're logical. What do you mean by that?
Their construction is kind of the same, though the person's very short, and I can expand on that same time.
Okay, so there's something about the construction that's logical. Okay, because that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the construction, and I know it's like, oh, maybe we're not that interested in what studies serve for, but like we can just sort of let that go, because we're not going to look too much at, we can talk a little bit about word choice, but really we're looking at syntax. Yeah.
They appear to get progressively longer as sentences.
Uh-huh.
First one is the shortest.
Yeah.
The second one is longer, and the third is the longest.
Right, so and we can start to see how they build, you were kind of indicating this too, they build on one another, and the syntax actually is building on each other. Yeah.
They're very like symmetric in their word choice and poetic.
They're very symmetric, not in their word choice, but in the syntax, right, and how they're put together. What, can you give me an example of what you mean by that?
So it's like for the third sentence say,
Yeah,
we have like for expert and then and perhaps, and then you have like the semicolon
yeah,
at the after one.
yeah,
And that is also repeated in like the second sentence. You have like the semicolon after retiring, and then the word for. It's like very similar structure-wise.
yeah. Okay, so that third sentence, you're right. That third sentence, there's something about it that feels like it's the same on either side of that but in the semicolon, right? Yeah, yes.
Well, it sounds a little lyrical to me.
Mm-hmm. Rhythmic,
It's
you mean?
rhythmic, yeah, rhythmic, lyrical, sets of threes, you know. Studies serve for delight, for ornament, and for ability.
Yeah,
And then it goes, for ornament is in discourse, and for ability is in judgment and disposition of business. Like there's kind of like a ringing rhythm to the sentence structure.
because of that repetition, right? Yeah. Okay, so this is the use of parallel structure, which we see really early on in prose, right? So parallel structure means that the sentence structure is repeated. It's the same. And it's used for clarity, right? So it served for delight, for ornament, right? He uses the same, he repeats the preposition for each one. So it's not just for delight, ornament, and ability, which would be different. There's more of an emphasis on the fact that this is a series, and these are all the same, right? Okay, good. And then you were saying, okay, for the next part of it, their chief use for delight, and then the repetition of that, right? So that's going to be first, because that's parallel, is in privateness and retiring. And then what happens in the next one? What?
For ornament, it's repeated again.
It's repeated again. Yes, it's absolutely parallel, isn't it? Yeah, that's remarkable. And it has a certain rhythm because of it. And how about that last sentence? For expertmen can execute and perhaps judge of particulars. That's the rhythm's a little different there, right? There's a bit of an aside, one by one, but the general counsels and the plots of martial and affairs come best from those that are learned.
The repetition of four is helpful to continue the rhythm.
Yeah, yeah,
He's doing another four.
yes, yes, okay, good. Anything else you noticed about that or any of them? Yeah, Marty.
The use of, well, one is prepositional phrases, but then the use of a semicolon so early on, which
Yeah.
is sort of separate out of thought.
Yeah,
That surprised me. The comments didn't, but seeing that.
right, and it's true that in earlier writing, they use a semicolon more frequently. Sometimes now we might use a comma for some of those places. Like before the but, we might put a comma there, right, in that sentence. So one of the things that you might have noticed is that, do these sentences sound kind of straightforward to you? Does some of you say that? They don't? Well, what about studies serve for delight? Does that sound straightforward? I think it's because the wording's a little archaic, maybe. Well, it is straightforward, but why? I would say it is, because studies serve, what is that? That's the subject, right, and the verb, right? The main subject and the verb, and they're right away. They appear right away in the sentence. So the subject and the verb are right up front. So these are, all of these are independent clauses. All of these sentences are built of independent clauses. So what do I mean by that? Like, what's an independent clause?
I say
It can stand on its
subject and a
own.
verb.
Can stand on its own.
Can stand on its own as a sentence, right? Which
Yeah.
means it has a true subject and a true verb that is not subordinated by another word. So you have independent clauses in sentences, right? Those are the main clauses, the main part of the sentence where the big subject and verb is. Those are the big guys, right, where they carry all the power. And then you have other phrases and clauses that hang on to the independent one. They're dependent, right? They've got to hang on to something. Okay, so this is all independent clauses. Study, serve, for delight, right? It's a subject-verb complement, basically, and then a second complement for ornament and for ability, right? All an independent clause. Their chief use for delight, chief use is the, what part of the sentence? Just say it. It's the subject, yes. The chief use for delight. And what's the verb? Is in privateness and retiring. Or ornament. Second verb, right? It's got the same subject, chief use of delight. Okay, so these are all independent clauses, which is really interesting because, you know, this means that the emphasis is the same for all these independent clauses, right? Dependent clause would have less emphasis than a carry less weight than an independent clause. All right, for expert men can execute and perhaps judge by particulars one by one. Independent clause, right? What's the subject and what's the verb?
Man.
Expert men, what's the verb?
Execute.
Can execute. Okay, and judge, right? It's a compound verb. One by one. Okay, then but, and then what's the second part of that sentence? General counsels and plots and marshalling affairs come best from those that are learned. What's the subject?
General counsel.
Yeah. Legal, plural subject, but it's still just one subject, right?
Right.
And what's the verb? Come, right?
Right.
So it's two independent clauses. There's not anything that's dependent there yet. It's just two independent clauses. And they've been put together, right? What's the word that puts them together? But, right? And the semicolon. So that this is sometimes called, well, first of all, it's coordination. We often refer to this coordination. And there's a number of coordinating conjunctions. And if you don't know them, just make a little list, right? You can memorize them easily. And, but, for, nor, so, yet, right? That's the coordinating conjunctions. We have more now than we used to have. And those conjunctions can be used to put together two independent clauses, again, of equal weight, right? Because they're both independent. So, in Bacon and a lot of the earlier stuff, and we still see this today, sometimes that's called, when it's used in this way, it's called a balanced sentence. Does it sound like it has balance to you?
Yes.
Yeah, how come, Susan? What makes it seem like it has
Well,
balance?
because it has the subject verb, and then if you go longer, you have the coordinating conjunction
Yeah?
that balances both sides, because it has a subject and verb.
Okay, so that coordination and conjunction, you think of that as a little fulcrum, right? And on either side of it is an independent clause. So they're both independent clauses, which makes it balanced. And generally, they're about the same length, right? And they're the same weight in terms of importance. So it's balanced. Are you getting a sense of, you know, the way sentences, our sentence structure and our language is so connected, deeply connected to our thinking. So are you getting a sense of how in 1600s people like Bacon were thinking, or what their world might have been like? Pretty different from ours, right? So if you go to the next page and just look at the last one, I'll point out one more sentence to you. A lot of these other sentences are very similar to the ones we just looked at. Another, well, first of all, before we do that, I just want to say one thing. In terms of the balanced sentence and the parallel structure, which is used for lists, right? We've been using the word and sometimes, which can be a comparison, right? Things that are alike are in the lists. And then we saw the word but, which is to indicate a contrast. So these are meaning relationships in the language that have to be expressed through syntax. Okay, so the other one in our meaning relationship that's important is cause and effect. And we see this early on with a structure that's used quite a bit. These are the last two sentences. If his wit be not apt to distinguish or find differences, let him study the schoolmen. And then the next sentence, if he be not apt to be, there's a little bit of parallel structure, over matters and to call up one thing to prove another, let him study. So like the then's been left off, but it's kind of the if-then structure that's being used to indicate the simple logic of cause and effect. Okay. So we'll look at one more from the 1600s and keep thinking about like, wow, what kind of world is this? What kind of thinking would these humans be having? What would their thought patterns be like? So I've given you two by Dunn. Do you have the one, the fourth meditation the physician is sent for?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do that one first. It's kind of, the only copy I could find of this has all the old spelling. So just don't be put off by that. I kind of like it, but I'll read it out to you so you know what it says. I wanted to find a new one because mine was, the old one I had was too faded. It is too little to call man a little world except God. Man is diminutive to nothing. Okay, and in the section that I'm going to read, and there's one long sentence we're going to look at, what I'd like you to be noticing is the way in which syntax is being used here to build an analogy. So that already in prose and certainly in poetry, we're seeing the use of simile, metaphor, and in this case, a long analogy. Let's see. And man consists of more pieces, more parts than the world. Parallel structure, right? Than the world doeth, than the world is. And right away, so he's given us a thesis, you might say, right at the beginning, and it appears that it'd be hard to prove, right? Because the world is so much bigger than man. And if those pieces, so here he's going to prove it with an analogy, were extended and stretched out in man as they in the world, man would be the giant and the world would be the dwarf. The world but the mat, and the mat the world. Shoveling. No. You know what? Can I move you so you can see one? Do you know them? He's looking there. How about right there? See that seat right?
This is great for me.
There?
No, it's good. I do better when it's further away.
Okay, if all the veins in our bodies were extended to rivers, and all the sinews to veins of minds, and all the muscles that lie upon one another to hills, and all the bones to quarries of stone, and all other pieces to the proportion of those which correspond to them, are in the world, the air would be too little for this orb of man to move in. The firmament would be but enough for this star. For, as the whole world hath nothing to which something in man doth not answer, so hath man many pieces of which the whole world hath no representation. Okay, that is a really long sentence, right? But can you hear that it's orderly?
Yes.
Right. What makes it orderly? Like, how is it put together? What do you see going on in terms of parallel structure, independent clauses, coordination, or balance?
Compare and contrast. Is this what you were talking about?
Yes.
Like, well, first the body and then the world. It goes back and forth between the two.
Yeah. Yeah, and so, Margie, so how is that set up so that it's orderly?
well, he starts with the man
Yeah,
and starts with man being diminutive and then goes to the world and then changes it so that the man becomes larger and the world smaller.
yeah.
I think.
He reverses it,
Yeah,
right?
he reverses the order.
Right, but using the same structure.
Yeah.
Right, so there's balance. Yes, okay. In a way, that balance is being used to emphasize a contrast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or the reversal. Okay, good. Now, how about in that long one? Well, we could say right away that it's one of those if-then sentences, right? But what else do you see? Because this is a really hard sentence, but he makes it so clear and so beautiful, right? Because he's using all these things, right? Give me one way he's using them.
Let's see. What I really noticed was he builds the body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I guess that's independent causes, you know, the extension rivers, the sinews, the veins, the lines, I don't know.
All right, if all the veins in our bodies, that's the body, right, were extended to rivers, that's the world, right?
Right.
And
And
then,
the sinews.
then he uses that same construction in the next part.
How?
And,
Here you go on.
I mean, he has it with Andy's.
All the sinews in veins of, to the veins of mine, because the sinews are in the body, right?
Right.
Yeah?
So each time he's got something in italic, that's just extending that construction.
Yeah, you're on the right track.
Okay.
Okay, come on, guys, help her out, explain it. How's it working? Yeah, yeah,
Because he's like comparing the specific things, like he's going back and forth, because you could
Yeah.
say, you could just list like parts of the body
right.
and say like the veins, the sinews, the muscles are like the rivers.
Right.
But because he's going one by one, it's much more clear.
Is much more clear. You can imagine that he might have made, you could make a list, right? You
Yeah.
could list on one side of the list the body, right? Sinews, and on the other side, veins of minds and muscles. And, or muscles on the next one, and then hills, right? So, I mean, you could list it all and have it all be parallel, right? And then how has he reinforced the fact that it's parallel with the syntax?
Repeating it by putting them always in the same order.
Yes,
So it's always the.
yes.
Like you could say the body has veins and sinews and muscles and bone, and the world has, and those four things. But instead he says the body has veins, like whatever,
Yes.
rivers. And
Yes.
it's always the body first and then the world. The
And-
body and then the world.
And all the muscles, oh, that's repeated, right? Yeah,
I think his use of the comma is also very interesting to look at.
yes.
In particular, he says like, and all the bones.
Mhm.
So he's like making the direct, like, he's directly showing you like what he wants you to,
Yeah.
compare like bones with.
Yes, yes. So that, you mean it comes after the comma, where the comma comes after stones, is that what you're saying?
Before, so like, and all the bones to the quarries of stones. So yeah, like that, the comma before, the comma after stones, and then the comma before and.
Okay, so that's set apart by commas.
Right.
So he's using commas for each item in the list. So each item in the list is a repeated structure syntactically showing the comparison, using some of the same language even, right? Yeah, and then you finally get to the proportion of those that correspond, and all the other pieces to the proportion of those which correspond to them in the world, which is still repeating the words, right? All is still repeated, all the, and to the world. And then here's his point. Than has been left off, but this is the if-then part of the phrase. Then the air would be too little for this orb of man to move, and the firmament would be parallel structure, right? Do you hear it?
Yep.
Would be enough but for the star, and even the rhythms are repeated. And then for, as the world has nothing. So how's that for acting? That for is different, right?
He's making a point, he's just using to make a point for as a whole, to change the thought.
Right, because now we're going to get a new independent clause, because that whole long thing was one independent clause. Here's our little fulcrum, right? It's not quite balanced because the second half is shorter. But we've got a coordinating conjunction for with a semicolon before it and a comma afterwards. For as the whole world, subject, and what's the verb? Hath nothing. To which something in man doth not answer, which is an aside, right? So, and here's the rest of the verb, hath man many pieces, of which the whole world, and that part is parallel as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, isn't that beautiful? I mean, parallel structure used to create this many-layered analogy. And everything is coordinated. What?
That's what I was thinking, the if then, right, the whole analogy with his premises and the reasoning for why it should be true.
Right, right. The if-then really is the cause and effect. So that's kind of the, I guess maybe the overall meaning is getting across. But
His
then
argument, his point. Yeah.
his point, you're right, his argument. And then the analogy is the thing that proves it. Yeah, the extended use of the extended analogy. There's also this great balanced sentence at the end of that one on the second page. His diseases are his own, but the physician is not. Right? There's a balanced sentence right there, and then a semicolon, and then here comes another one right after the semicolon. He hath them at home, but he must send for the physician. Two balanced sentences put together to form another balanced sentence. Did you love it? So great. So what kind of a world is this, do you think? No, I don't think it's crazy. I think it's logical. At least that's the way they saw it, as logical.
And people were educated in rhetoric.
Right, right.
So
Well,
this is a way of thinking and presenting arguments.
yeah, yeah.
And more than that, like a way of knowing.
Yes.
Like inductive reasoning as a way of knowing, which at the time of the enlightenment was like a honored mode of thought, different from the sort of scientific deductive reasoning that dominates our way of knowing.
Yeah, yeah. In a way, it all seems kind of, everything's laid out, right? It's all very orderly, everything in its place, you know? And everything with equal emphasis. So there's not, in a way, there's not a lot of complexity because of that, even though, you know, the structures is complex in a long sentence, and Donne has a complex mind, so he's given us this long-winded analogy. All right, so I want to look just briefly at one more. I'm spending more time in the 1600s than I thought I would. We'll look at the last page of For Whom the Bell Tolls, because this is famous. It's an if-then statement. So this is the last page of it, page 13, if you see a page number at the top of it, 13. All right, no man is an island entire of himself, semicolon. Semicolon, again, here acting as a fulcrum, so there's a little bit of, there's a sense of balance here. Two independent clauses being put together, side by side. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And then here's another if-then statement. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if the manner of thy friends or of thine own were. You know, and so you could say, well, you can you hear that that's parallel structure again, as well as if the promontory, as well as if a manner of thy friends were there. So first of all, before we go any further, what's the effect of the parallel structure there? Like you could have left off the second one, but you put it in.
It just seems to emphasize the point, even though it's like a little clod of dirt being washed away from Europe, it's gone, and it's the same as if it was a huge landmass or your own house.
Or your friend's house, right? So, I don't know. There's a way in which it really, I think you're right, it amplifies the meaning, and it's almost becomes emotional, because this is very beautiful, kind of emotional, has an impactful statement. And then there's a colon there, sort of, often a colon will mean therefore, and here it does. And here's a new independent clause, right? Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. There's like we could count them. I think there's like 4 independent clauses in that one sentence. And parallel structure, and a couple of different instances where coordination and sort of a balanced sentence is being used.
There's also kind of this thought process used in that parallel structure. I mean, that may be what we're talking about with the orderly and the logic, but by repeating that structure, he's showing his thinking to get somebody off this.
Right, and you can follow it, right? Parallel structure will make things clear. Definitely will make lists clear, but you might also begin to hear that it has a real rhythm to it. So as a writer, there's a lot of other reasons to use parallel structure, you know, for emphasis and for the prose rhythms. Okay, so the modest proposal. Have you got that one next? So now we're up to 1729, so we're in the next century. Now, I just gave you 2 pages of it, and I'm not even going to do the second 3 pages of it. I'm not going to do one of the pages because I decided I didn't have time. So do you know this essay at all? So this is the Jonathan Swift is writing about in response to the British who were taxing the Irish to the point where they were starving. And so he writes this great satire, and his modest proposal, which of course he means satirically, is that they should take all the babies that are born and sell them as meat to the British, who can use them for food. And so the extremity of that proposal is meant to shock everyone into realizing how bad this situation is. So I'd like to look at that first paragraph on page 18, the sentence, the long sentence. I think it is agreed by all parties that this prodigious number of children in arms are on the backs or at the heels of their mothers, and frequently their fathers, is in the present deplorable state of the kingdom a very great additional grievance, and therefore whoever could find out a fair, cheap, and easy method of making these children sound and useful members of a commonwealth would deserve so well of the public to have a statue set up, which will be Jonathan Swift, presumably, for a preserver of the nation. All right, so what do you notice about the structure of that long sentence in regards to these things we've been looking at?
It's adding a lot of detail. It's almost like, well, get to the point, because it's a lot of stuff that you could almost put it in parentheses. And then, you know, he says, you know, if you could come up with a way to make these people useful,
right,
you could get a statue erected to you, in a nutshell, but he goes on and on about it.
Right, because that's the satirical elements are all, and the things that he's going to be satirizing are all. The satire is an argument, so all the things he's going to be arguing against are in that sentence. Yeah.
It's punctuated by the 2 lists of 3.
Yes.
It's arms, backs, heels, and fair, cheap, easy, which gives this nice rhythm.
Yes. 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 And there's a sense of because it's that's
yes,
parallel structure
yeah.
too. Yes. Yes. Parallel structure, parallel rhythms. Good. Okay. Anything else being used for the list, right? Anything else that you notice?
The verb is kind of in the middle there.
What verb? Is?
So the children, all parties of this prodigious number of children is the present.
Right.
So it takes a while to get to his point.
I get to get to the verb. That's right. So that's a good notice. I think it is agreed by all parties that this prodigious number of children, and then you're waiting for the verb, right? Your ears kind of going, oh, where's that verb? All right. In the arms or on the backs or at the heels of their mothers, this is kind of aside. That's maybe what you were talking about. This aside about like where all those children were. Frequently their fathers is in the present a deplorable state of the kingdom. Right, so there's a delay there, isn't there? It's a couple different ways of looking at that. I mean, in a way, you could say that there's an aside, right, of all those modifiers. I mean, the other way of thinking about it, and this is where you're starting to see this, and we'll see more of it, is that it's a periodic, a little bit of a, it's not a complete periodic sentence. I mean, that's at the end of the sentence right there. But that the verb has been separated from its subject. So there's kind of an emphasis on the verb because we're waiting for it. When we finally get it, you're glad you got it, right? Yeah.
I just find it so interesting, so curious that he says, he doesn't use and, he uses or the backs, or the heels, and frequently the fathers. I mean, he could use and all the way through, or he could use or all the way through.
Right.
He chooses to mix or and and.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right, because it's the or, it would just be the mothers, it could be on those, but it could be on the father's backs or heels also. I think it's the meaning of it, but yeah. Yeah, yeah. Did you like the variety of it? that
I
changed
do,
the
because
emphasis?
you could just as easily say, this prodigious number of children in the arms, and on the backs, and at the heels of their mothers, and frequently their fathers. It almost doesn't change the meaning spectacularly.
But it sounds better.
I like the or better, because
Yeah. Well, then there's more emphasis on the last one, right? I guess, you could say that, yeah.
Speaking to that same point, you also, if you were to replace like those phrases with like letters, right?
Yeah.
You would have the or being, or at the heels of the mother. So the or is used just on that side of the sentence, and the and is used to connect to the other side. So it's almost like two in one as well, and just using that different,
Right.
the different coordinating conjunction. Sorry, I couldn't think of the word.
Right.
Just to signify that you're kind of switching to the other side of the balance.
Okay, yeah, that's a good way to look at it. So then there is still kind of a sense of things being parallel there. Yeah, I would call that parallel structure, even though the word changes. The other thing that you might have noticed, well, do you see anything else in terms of all of this? Do you see any coordination or balanced sentence
I was
in terms
noticing,
of independent clauses? Yeah.
well, I was noticing in the first part,
Yeah.
I think it is agreed by all parties that this prodigious number of children, and then later on he comes back, an easy method of making these children.
Uh-huh. A repetition of the phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah, which he's got to do because this is such a long sentence.
This and these, right, to bring it back together so you can follow the thought.
Right, right. So the word that's connecting the two bigger independent clauses is and, therefore, right, with a semicolon before it and a comma afterwards. This is, again, a coordination, which we still use today. Now, usually when you're doing coordination today, we just have a comma before the coordinating conjunction. You notice that at this time period, they often will have a semicolon before it, kind of for emphasis, and then a comma after it. So that gets dropped eventually. But note that when you're putting independent clauses together, there's got to be some kind of punctuation, right? So if there's not a period and you're putting them together in one sentence, there's got to be some other kind of punctuation, either a semicolon or a comma. So that's one of the things to keep in your mind about like when you use punctuation. The other parts where you'll see punctuation being used, where it might be instructive to see it, is right after the therefore. Therefore, whoever could find out a fair, cheap, and easy method of making these children sound and useful members. So when you've got a list like that, that's another time when you're going to be using coordination. Commas. Okay. Let's see. This is sort of a new thing that we're seeing, so I'll point it out, and you're going to see more of this. We don't have to do this whole sentence, but down at the bottom of the page, sentence that starts, a number of souls in Ireland already being reckoned, a little bit further down after the semicolon, from which number I subtract 30,000 couples who are able to maintain their own children, although I apprehend there cannot be so many under the present distresses of the kingdom, right? Which is often called a parenthetical element, coming from, that's where parentheses comes from. So it's an aside So it's not needed for the sense of it, but of course he's using it to create the satire. So this is, you know, this is the thing that he's objecting to in terms of his argument in the satire. So there are different ways of separating out a parenthetical, and one of them is using parentheses. And keep watching for those, because you'll notice, you know, as we move forward, you start seeing more complicated sentences. We'll get more of those parentheticals. Let's see, I might look at this very last page. Well, this is a real simple one. At the end, he's winding up here. It's the last sentence. It's kind of long again. I profess in my sincerity of heart that I have not the least personal interest in endeavoring to promote this necessary work, having no other motives than the public good of my country, by advancing our trade, providing for infants, relieving the poor, and giving some pleasure to the rich. So that's one that's real easy to hear, right? The parallel structure being used for a list. So each one of those is a verbal phrase using ing, form of the verb. Okay, so we're moving across the ocean now to the 1800s. I'm going to keep going back and forth a little bit now. I have given you a little bit of Thoreau's essay, famous essay, Civil Disobedience. Have you got that one next? Okay, I'd like to go down a couple of sentences. Do you see the one that starts off, government is at best but an expedient? You see that one? You got it? Okay, government is at best but an expedient, but most governments are usually, and all governments are sometimes, inexpedient. Not practical, right? That's kind of one of the famous sentences from this. All right, so what could you tell me about the construction of that sentence? So it's really effective, right? Let's say that. Well, right away you see a but. Like, is it being used to coordinate? Contrast, right? It's a contrast. What means is a contrast, signaling contrast.
Showing the ideal versus what is.
Showing the ideal versus what is. Right. That's good.
I mean, it's a completely balanced sentence because it has two independent phrases, but it's government is, but government is not inexpedient. It's perfectly balanced.
And it's perfectly balanced. You got it. What's the effect of that?
I mean, it's punchy. You remember it. It's perfect.
Yeah. Being used to emphasize a contrast, and that's
Yes.
what creates the irony, isn't
Yeah.
it?
It's the irony.
Yes. There's a balanced sentence creating irony. It's great. So now we're starting to see, if we were start to list these, I don't know how much room I have on here, but we've seen extended analogy. And this is irony, right? Trying to think what other ones we've seen. Use of literary techniques. Well, you can point them out to me as we see them. We can start to listen because simultaneously, as the sentence is developing, literary techniques are developing. So there's more and more literary techniques that are available as writers start to do more and more things with them. So it's great the way inexpedient is set off too, right? And all governments are sometimes inexpedient. So there's a little bit of kind of periodic emphasis on that helps contribute to the irony. Okay, let's see, there's another one I wanted to look at here. Let's see. Well, if you can just look a little bit at that next sentence, we don't have to do the whole thing, but the objections which have been brought against the standing army, and they are many and weighted and deserve to prevail, may also, we're still seeing mostly independent clauses, would you agree? Yeah, there's a few more dependent phrases being used. Like even, which have been brought against a standing army, right? Which is a modifying phrase. So we're starting to see some bigger sentence units, like modifying phrases, and in a couple instances, clauses, kind of hanging on to the independent clause. But still, mostly all independent clauses, put together through coordination, balance, and parallel structure, and the use of parallel structure. Let's see. Top of page 39, and I think I won't do the last page. This American government, this is kind of an interesting sentence. So for the most part, up until now, if you're looking at a number of these, what you'll see is that sentences follow one mode or another. In other words, it's either a statement or a question, right? They do have questions, but it's either a statement or a question. Here we've got this interesting sentence. This American government, what is it but a tradition, though a recent one, endeavoring to transmit itself unimpaired to prosperity, but each instance losing some of its integrity, right? So the sentence seems to be a statement initially. It seems like it's going to be a statement, and then he's got a dash, which is a kind of more modern, I think, use of punctuation, and then it turns right into a question. Yeah.
What I really like about that is it also gives the term and definition side of it, so it keeps the balance there, even though it's not a full independent clause on the left.
You're right. Yeah, that's good. So there still is a sense of balance. Yeah. Okay, good. All right, let's see. Do you have George Orwell next?
Yes.
So now we're moving ahead pretty quickly. And then because I do want to do a bunch on the contemporary. All right, so you should have Orwell, and then The Death of the Moth, and then we've got a page from Martin Luther King. Okay, so I gave you just a little bit of shooting an elephant. I didn't give you a lot of that, but the reason I did this is because this is a good example. This essay is a very good example of narrative style that by now is being developed. And if you look at that paragraph, it's paragraph 11. So it's the one that begins, when I pulled the trigger. When I pulled the trigger, I did not hear the bang or feel the kick. One never does when one shot goes home. But I heard a devilish roar of glee that went up from the crowd. So we'll look at that sentence first. So what do you notice there? It's a different sort of sentence than the one we've been looking at, ones we've been looking at.
Independent clauses.
Yeah, what's that?
Independent clauses.
There are, okay, what are the independent clauses?
I might be wrong.
No, you're not.
Okay,
Just roll.
word of it. When I pull the trigger, I did not hear the bang or feel a kick. Boom. One never does when a shot goes home. Boom.
But I heard a devilish.
But I heard devilish roar of glee that went up from the crowd. Boom.
Good. Three independent clauses. That's excellent. Okay, and one of them is put together through coordination, right, with the but. And the other one is used as a parenthetical, right, set off by dashes. So these parentheticals are kind of the statements that are like asides, like, oh, and I want to add this in, by the way, right? So you've got some choices here, right? You can use parentheses, we all saw that, and you can use a dash on either side, right? The other possibility is you can use commas to set them off, which you see more in modern or contemporary writing. This being the one that sets it off the least, parentheses being the one that sets it off the most. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. He's got three of those, and there is coordination that's used to show a contrast. Okay, it's a little bit different because of the when I pulled the trigger, right? What's different about that?
That one has no punctuation in it.
It's what?
It has no punctuation. I mean, it doesn't have a comma or anything.
Yeah, and you could put a comma, it would be optional after trigger, right? When I pulled the trigger. So when I pulled the trigger, that is a dependent clause, right? Or subordination would be another word for it. So that is a dependent clause. So by now, 1900s, and really kind of latter part of the 1800s, you start to see more and more dependent clauses. I could say, well, how come it's dependent? Because it has a subject and verb. I is the subject, pull the trigger is the verb. But how come it's dependent?
Because it needs the.
Because of when? What?
When.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's what I was gonna say, because of when, it needs the independent to make it complete.
Right,
It
because
can't stand on its own.
we say when, we know that it's going to connect to something, right? It's like when I pull the trigger, what next? Right? That when, it's like looking for the real one to connect to, right? So that when you start to see dependent clauses now, I guess I should just turn this. All right, so now that we're starting to see some dependent clauses, so not equally weighted anymore, right? So the weight for the meaning in the sentence, for the emphasis, goes with the independent part of the clause. So when I pulled the trigger, the real important part of that is, I didn't hear the bang or feel the kick. What I heard was this devilish roar of glee that went up from the crowd. That's the emphasis, right? Okay.
But it's the dependent clause, the catalyst, or does it matter?
It's not a catalyst, really. I mean, it's got to be connected to it. I guess in terms of the meaning of, like that was the catalyst for their reaction. But syntactically, it's just, it is a modifier. So it's hanging on to the rest of it. Yeah.
So would it be better to have that sentence as when I pulled the trigger, I did not hear the bang or feel the kick? Or I pulled the trigger and when I did not hear the bang or feel the kick?
What do you think?
Personally, I would write it the second way.
Say it again.
I pulled the trigger and when I did, like in this, like
I pulled the trigger, and when I did,
I did not hear the bang or feel the kick.
it's kind of wordy. I think that.
It is wordy.
Yeah.
Or it becomes, I pull the trigger, period.
How is, one never does when a shot goes home? How is that an independent clause?
How is it? Oh, one never does when a shot goes home. Okay, Lorenzo, how come that's an independent clause?
Oh my goodness, you did it. Because it can stand on its own.
No, it can't.
Yes, it can. How come? Stick with it. How come?
One never does. So
It needs to have a
What's the true
It's a
subject
subject
and
and it's a
verb?
subject and a verb.
What's the subject?
One.
One, yep.
Never does.
Never does is the verb.
Right.
When the shot goes home, that's another dependent clause that's acting as a modifier, right? Yeah.
Yep.
One never does what?
One
No, it's the
never
when-
does.
When a shot goes home is the
One,
question.
Right.
one never does here. It's here is understood.
When the shot goes
Here,
home.
no, here is in the clause before it.
Right, so it's not repeated there, but it still would be an independent clause. Because it's a subject and a verb, and it hasn't been subordinated by a word that's in front of it, like when or after. I agree with you, it sounds a little bit fragmented on its own, but it still would be an independent clause, because it has its own subject and verb. I know, well, this stuff is just.
Looks like a
kind of fun.
technicality. You
It's a
probably wouldn't
technicality.
write that as.
Right, you're not gonna write that as a subject.
They wouldn't get a
It is gonna be
squiggle.
a parenthetical, but the thing that's kind of interesting about it is that it's strung together, 3 independent clauses, a couple of dependent clauses are thrown in the mix, and he somehow got it all in one sentence. So this looks like a fairly simple sentence, but it's really not. In some ways, it's more complicated than the other ones we were looking at, right? Because it's got dependent clauses as well. Now, notice that what happens next when he starts to describe what's going on a little further down. He neither stirred nor fell, but every line of his body had altered. He looked suddenly stricken, shrunken, immensely old. So the frightful impact of the bullet had paralyzed him without knocking him down. You go down a little bit further. At last, after what seemed a long time, it may have been 5 seconds, he really likes these parentheticals, I dare say. He sagged flabbily to his knees. His mouth slobbered. A little further down, one could have imagined him thousands of years old. I fired again into the same spot. At the second shot, he did not collapse but climbed. Fired a third time. So what are you starting to notice about the sentences and the structure and the kind of the rhythms and style of the style of that? It's short. A lot of them are short. What?
Short. Like short to long.
like variation.
Short to long. Good. Variation. Okay, so there's more of a variety of sentence structure here. Yeah, a sentence length. Right, so some are short, some are long, right? And there's a real narrative style here with sentences that are formed around active verbs. I fired, subject, the active verb right up at the front. He sagged to his knees. So that kind of emphasis on the verb that's so effective in narrative writing is really visible there. And did you also hear that there was some parallel structure in some of those sentences in the list? Yeah? Did you hear it? Okay. And there is also a little bit of coordination in a couple of those. All right. Okay, let's look at Death of the Moth. This is 1942, so right around the same time. By Virginia Woolf. So this is a fairly short essay. I just gave you the whole thing. Famous essay by her. All right.
Which one is it?
Death of the Moth. Do you not have that? Have you guys got it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Did you not get this? Okay, I can look on. We might have more of those.
Here it is.
Oh, you found it. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So we'll look at a couple of sentences here. Well, one sentence, and then I'll just look at the extended. There's an extended metaphor here in this one. Nevertheless, the present specimen, this is just a few third sentence in, with his narrow hay-colored wings fringed with a tassel of the same color, seemed content with life. So that's sort of unusual in terms of structure. We haven't really seen that before. What's weird about it? Nevertheless, the present specimen, with his narrow hay-colored wings fringed with a tassel of the same color, seemed to be content with life. Yeah, Andrew.
Well, it kind of has like those positive phrases tucked in, so little descriptors before you get to the rest of the sentence.
Yeah, good.
Spread out.
What's that?
It's really spread out.
It's really spread out because of that. What's really spread out?
The verb and the noun.
The verb and the noun. Great. So nevertheless, the present specimen, right, that's the noun, the subject of the sentence. And then you've got these, I think you said descriptive words, Andrew, which is true, these modifiers that are describing it. With his narrow hay-colored wings, she's using these phrases for the details, fringed with tassel of the same color. And what's the verb? Seemed to be content with life. So there's another periodic sentence with the subject and verb that are separated. Okay, then we'll look at this sentence that begins the rooks, and this is an extended metaphor. The rooks, too, were keeping one of their annual festivities, semicolon. soaring round the treetops until it looked as if a vast net with thousands of black knots in it had been cast up into the air, semicolon, which after a few minutes sank slowly down upon the trees until every twig seemed to have a knot at the end of it. Okay, it's a long image, or kind of a well-developed image, and comparison. So, what can you tell me about the structure of that? Like, how is the structure being used to build the extended metaphor or comparison? Jeff?
I don't have it in front of me.
She starts off with an independent clause, right? The Rooks too were keeping one of their annual festivities. That's just a pretty straightforward independent clause. Then what happens? Yeah.
She includes a verb after each section of semicolon. So it kind of extends the sentence by saying like this first part applies to this and this first part applies to this.
Okay. All right, so you mean like the one before soaring? Soaring around the treetops until it looked as if thousands of black knots in it had been cast up in the air. Right, so that's a independent clause, yeah?
And the Rooks were keeping, so then they were soaring, and then, which after a few moments sank.
Yes. Okay, good. She separates out their activities with those. Yeah, good. Okay. Anything else? It's not really parallel structure, is it? No. No. It's not all even the way the other ones were.
Is it all metaphors? I mean, afterwards, the Rooks too were keeping, there's the sentence, and then it's followed by.
Right, the Rooks are being compared. So do you have the picture, at least like the Rooks are flying up, right?
Yeah.
And they look like a vast net of thousands of knots. It gets cast up in the air. That's all the individual birds, right? And then after a few minutes, they sink down onto the twig. Every one seemed to have a knot at the end of it. So in a way, she's doing something kind of similar to done, right? In that she's mixing the words that would have to do with net, like knots, and the words that would have to do with the Rooks, like soaring, right, and air. So she's mixing those up to create this extended metaphor. But it's interesting because she's not using parallel structure, right? Yeah. Do you have a thought about it, just no? Yeah, yeah.
No, but I'm saying it's just the rhythm of it, just like you just did, right? There's the up and there's the down.
Yes.
And there's the total and there's the singular.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just the rhythm of it gives it almost a balance. I mean, it's.
The rhythm is still there. I mean, to me, there's a little bit of an echo of done in that.
Echo, yeah.
I would say. Although she's using, which is really interesting, dependent clauses to do it. Because soaring, and phrases, soaring around the tree trunks is a phrase, right?
Right.
Until it looked as if, and then we got this long clause, yeah. And then which, after a few moments. So, I don't know if you're starting to, if you can hear this or kind of see it, but syntax is becoming more complicated and complex as we're moving forward in time. Because now we've got lots of dependent clauses and phrases that are hanging on every which way. And not everything is completely coordinated or parallel anymore. Right?
I'm not really looking at it, but why the semicolons then?
You know, I think that those were optional, you know. They could have been like most of us, you know, you think that usually before a phrase that begins with soaring, like an ing word, a participle, usually there would just be a comma there. But it's such a long sentence, I'm guessing.
And she has the other one after
her head. Okay. Yeah, that she's trying to divide it up because she wants more of a separation.
And she's obsessed with semicolons. She'll throw them in everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and in this 1800s, certainly, you know, and certainly if you look in the 1600s, they're using a lot more semicolons. So semicolon is really much more in use earlier on.
Yeah.
And she's, you know, maybe more influenced still by who was before her. But really, you don't see the semicolon going out, I don't think so much, until you get into the more modern writing.
I'm bringing it back.
I think that's true. I would guess that it is, but I might be wrong. Yeah, yeah. But you're right, you know, like a semicolon, a semicolon and a comma can often be exchanged. Not always. We only use them now, like once in a while, when it really fits, it seems like. Okay, so what we've added on here is we've got more varied sentence lengths. And we saw that in Orwell, but if you look down through this essay, you'll see that also. Varied sentence length and structure. To include dependent phrases, clauses, and parentheticals. Things that don't really quite fit in the sentence, right? I feel like I don't have enough time to do all these, but I'll just give you a quick one of parallel structure, and also that shows variety. This is on page 106, second to last, well, before the last paragraph, those couple of sentences. After perhaps, this is a very dramatic turning point in the essay because the moth is dying. After perhaps a tenth, he slipped, subject verb, right, from the wooden ledge and fell, fluttering his wings on to his back on the windowsill. The helplessness of this attitude roused me. It flashed upon me he was in difficulties. And this is how we would more naturally use more normally use a semicolon. He could no longer raise himself. His legs struggled vainly. But as I stretched out the pencil, meaning to help him right himself, it came over me that the failure and awkwardness were approach of death. I laid the pencil down. So you might have been able to hear that kind of variation of both length and structure there. And then where you have those three semicolons, there's parallels. There's a little bit of parallel structure being used there. So she still is using some of that. Okay. The other thing that you're seeing in these, along with this, is the use of independent clauses for main ideas and dependent clauses for subordinate ideas. So in other words, this complexity of sentence structure that's building mirrors the complexity of thought, right? That not everything is equally being emphasized. Okay. If we look at this Martin Luther King one, 1963, and then I just want to do a couple that are contemporary. Last two paragraphs of this famous letter. If I have said anything, he's speaking to the other ministers in his church who, many of them who weren't supporting, he's writing this from jail, who weren't supporting him and his cause. If I've said, and he's kind of been reprimanding them for it. If I've said anything in this letter that overstates the truth and indicates an unreasonable impatience, this is the if-then structure again, right? I beg you to forgive me. If I've said anything that understates the truth and indicates my having patience that allows me to settle for anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. Mm-hmm. It's a great use of parallel structure, right? How come? What's the effect?
It goes from lesser to greater.
What?
It goes from a
lesser to greater. Right, right. If I've overstated you and hurt your feelings, right, by criticizing you, I'm sorry. If I understated you and didn't criticize you enough, then what? And I hope God will forgive me. It's like terribly ironic, and the parallel structure really emphasizes it. And then there's that last section, which has wonderful rhythms, which you might have heard before. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away, and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And this is a great kind of aside, right? Use of an aside to kind of emphasize what comes afterwards. And in some not too distant future, and here comes the thing that's being emphasized, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. Okay. I'm going to wait on total eclipse. I'll see if we have time for it. I love that essay, but I'm not really sure we're going to have enough time. And I want to do these last two, Jamaica Kincaid and the David Foster Wallace. So this is a great essay by Jamaica Kincaid, and she's writing about her experience of colonialism, and she's writing about having seen England for the first time. And she had grown up studying all about England, but not living there. And so the first sentence is very simple, right? When I saw English for the first time, that's a dependent clause. Then the independent clause, I was a child in school sitting at a desk. The England I was looking at was laid out on a mat, gently, beautifully, delicately, a very special jewel. Parallel structure for a list. Do you hear that?
Yeah.
You see it? Yeah. Okay. It, and semicolon, because now she's going to start a new independent clause with standalone sentence. It lay on a bed of sky blue. The background of the map. What's the background of the map? What?
The ocean, blue.
Blue. It's blue, but how come it's got those dashes at either end? It's a parenthetical, right? It's just like, oh, by the way, it was the background of the map. It's yellow form mysterious because though it looked like a leg of mutton, right? It could not really look like anything so familiar as a leg of mutton because it was England, dash, with shadings of pink and green, unlike any shadings of pink and green I had ever seen before, squiggly veins of red running in every direction. Oh, wow, what a wild sentence. So what do you see about it? I mean, I would say right off that it has to be really complicated because her feelings are really, this is a really complicated situation. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say also she's a child.
Yeah.
Sitting at a desk.
Yeah.
So the way that you're thinking.
Well, in terms of the comparison she chooses, the leg of mutton. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and I'm saying how complicated it is too, right? Because it couldn't really, you're saying it looked like a leg of mutton, but it couldn't really look like anything so familiar.
Yeah.
Right? I mean.
Yeah. That's the complication, isn't it? It's ironic. I mean, it's really, I haven't been listing too many of these. I mean, by now we have like simile, metaphor, extended analogy, and lots of different kinds of irony. But this is really litotes, right? Litotes, which is really which is a kind of something that's understated by stating the negative. And, so it's a really kind of complicated literary technique that she's using.
What is that called, Karen?
Like, here, I'll spell it, litotes, here.
So what is that again? It's understating something.
It's you achieve understatement by using a negative. You say what something is not.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a couple of different asides in there, and there's a bunch of dependent clauses. She does use balanced sentences in a couple of places as well. Like, if you go down just a little bit further, England was a special jewel, all right, comma, and only special people got to wear it. And the word special there, I think, also helps to create the balance. So we're still seeing some of those same sentence patterns that we saw early on, some of the same syntax. But by now there's like so much else going on, right? And here's a great use of parallel structure, bottom of that paragraph. We understood then, we were meant to understand then, parenthetical, right, aside, that in England was to be, and it's an important aside, that England was to be our source of myth and the source from which we got our sense of reality, our sense of what was meaningful, our sense of what was meaningless. It's like parallel structure being used to make that ironic or to emphasize the irony or contrast, and much about our lives and much about the very idea of us headed that list. So by now, you can really see with Jamaica Kincaid just all of the different effects that a sentence can pull off rhythmically and structurally to get across these very complex notions of what it means to be living on a colony of another country and how you end up seeing that country. How do you see it? On page 370, there's a really great passage. If I had told an English person what I thought, that this is when she's visiting England for the first time, that I find England ugly, parallel structure coming up, that I hate England, semicolon, the weather is like a jail sentence. The English are very ugly people. The food in England is like a jail sentence. I mean, it's great, right? Can you hear the rhythms of that too? It's like bullets. The hair of English people is so straight, so dead looking. The English have an unbearable smell, so different from the smell of the people I know. Real people, of course, an aside, right, with commas there instead of parentheses. Subject, verb, finally, I would, so that's a real delay of the subject and verb, I would have been told I was a person full of prejudice. And there's a lot of, because that subject and verb is delayed, there's a lot of emphasis on that. I would have been told I was a person of prejudice. And then this long kind of introductory clause, apart from the fact that it is I, that is, here's an aside, the people who look like me, who look like, who would make that English person aware of an unpleasantness of such a thing, the idea of such a thing. I don't know if you can hear how complicated that is, but she just keeps having to add on these phrases because she's got to qualify what she's saying, because it's so hard. And finally it ends up with, my prejudices have no weight on them. They have no force behind them. This is parallel structure. My prejudices remain opinions. My prejudices remain personal opinions. The people I come from are powerless to do evil on a grand scale, which is such a, then she ends it with a simple sentence. So it's a, sentence variety. Are you following along, or am I confusing you? I'm kind of confusing you, is that what you said? Have you read David Foster Wallace? He does lots of fun things with sentences. He's kind of all over the place. And an example, both of them are examples by now of what writers can do with sentences, which is so great, like living in a time period where you have all kinds of varied structures, sentence structure at your disposal. You can do anything. You can bring all of this to bear, right? And you can kind of get away with it. Okay, so page 237. He's talking about lobsters and saying that they're great giant insects, giant sea insects. So he uses a lot of parentheticals, and here's one. And they are, particularly in their natural brown state, brandishing their claws like weapons and with thick antennae and a whip, not to nice to look at all. So what's the effect of that parenthetical there? Well, how will you laugh? Is it funny? Sort of? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's meant to be funny. Okay. And then he's got, versus the footnote at the bottom, we'll cook up some bugs. So by now, writers are using, a writer like David Foster Wallace is also using lots of different word choice from lots of different areas of vocabulary that normally might not even fit together. Mixing kind of these levels of diction. Well, we'll look at one more long sentence, and then I'll leave you alone with long sentences. I'm trying to pick the best one. Give me a chance here. Let's see. Okay, last page. Up at the top. So he's talking about the editor of Food and Wine. He says, nothing against the euphoric senior editor of Food and Wine, but I'd be surprised if she'd ever actually been here, the place where they have this lobster festival, in Harbor Park amid crowds of people, slapping canal zone mosquitoes as they eat deep-fried Twinkies and watch Professor Paddywhack on 6-foot stills in a raincoat with plastic lobsters protruding from all directions on springs, terrify their children. So it's a great list, right, of modifiers and dependent clauses and phrases. And where's the emphasis in the sentence? What phrase is emphasized in the sentence? The last one, right. Terrify your children. Yeah. And then he still uses, like if you look at that footnote at the bottom, he still uses parallel structure and balanced sentences. It is to spoil, this is at the end of it, by way of sheer ontology, the very unspoiledness of which you are there to experience. It is to impose yourself on places that are in all non-economic ways would be better and realer without you. It is in lines and grid walk. I mean, it almost sounds like Francis Bacon's rhythms, right? So you can hear those rhythms all the way through. All right, so we have just a couple of minutes. I want to get you to write something. So write a balance. Write a list. Write a sentence. Like go back to the first essay. Okay. Studies serve for delight, for ornament, for ability. Write a sentence like that using parallel structure. A short one. It can be anything. You can start with the word snow if you want. Snow does something. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to make a lot of sense. You're just trying to get the rhythms.
Can you explain that one more time?
Like looking at this first one again, studies serve for, just write a sentence that sounds like that rhythmically, but uses different words. Or you can substitute writing if you want. And then if you get that one, try and write a balanced one.
That's what I need to hear.
Okay, do you have one, Lorenzo? He's laughing, guessing it was a good one.
I'm not sure. So snow falls pretty, fluffy, and wet.
Yeah, okay, good.
You said I was wrong.
I could have had to take that.
Do you want
I said, snow wiggles yet stuns, so to freeze and to numb.
How come I couldn't do that for mine?
So if that's not, that's like a little variation on being parallel, yeah. Just
Oh, I was
yours.
raising my hand, but I'll go. It said, I wrote, Molly was for country, for family, and for religion.
Yes, exactly, that's completely parallel. Yes.
Enders offers respite for our minds, for our souls, and for creativity.
Good. Those have the rhythms, right? Yeah.
Snow serves to remind us of winter, it's cold, and the need for heat working.
Did anybody do a balanced one?
Is that like
Oh, yeah, it's the third one, I think. The one that has and, like the fault one in the middle. And or what, like a coordinating conjunction.
I tried.
Yeah, good.
All right, snow falls over the island, covering the ground. But in the water of the sound, it melts silently, making the water slate gray.
That's great. The rhythms were the same. Can you read it again a little
Okay.
louder? Because the rhythms are the same on both sides
Okay.
even, for the most part.
Snow falls on the island, covering the ground. But in the water of the sound, it melts silently, making the water slate gray.
Nice. Okay. I love those rhythms. Okay, who else had one? Yes. Yes.
To inform the reader is to reveal a truth, and to delight the reader is to provide aesthetic pleasure.
All right, well, I have to let you go. So I hope that you, wait, am I letting you go? Is it 3:30? Is that when this ends? I couldn't remember all of a sudden. All right, I'm letting you go, but I hope that you will, I hope that you love sentences more and not that you hate them more because they're so hard.